the younger generation wanted to break loose, and of course that's what Benjamin does.
Well,
I think the younger generation loved seeing the older group described as phony, as alcoholic, as sex-obsessed.
In 1967, one landmark film blew the generation gap wide open and opened Hollywood's eyes to a daring new breed of filmmakers.
Well, the word plastics is the single most powerful one-word dialogue of American cinema.
are you listening?
Yes, sir, yeah.
Plastics.
An awful lot of people looked at him and said, yeah, I want romance, I want meaning, I want, something to believe in, and it isn't plastics.
How The Graduate pitted an innocent young hero against a corrupt seductress.
Would you like me to seduce you?
What?
Is that what you're trying to tell me?
And exposed audiences to a raw new sexuality
Don't be nervous.
and a fresh sensibility that revolutionized American film. The Graduate, up next on Movies That Shook the World. Hollywood spends $10 billion a year making movies. Some hit, some miss, some shake the world. December 1967. The Graduate opened to raves from youth,
I like it. This is my third time.
jeers from adults,
I just thought I would never live to see anything like this.
and instantly became Hollywood's top-grossing film.
Everyone was talking about The Graduate.
The Graduate.
The Graduate.
The Graduate.
It is one of the most exciting new movies of the year.
It truly was an overwhelmingly important film.
Well, we just saw Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate, both of which we think are among the best pictures we've seen for a long time, particularly The Graduate.
It is a 60s movie, but it is, I think it has universal appeal.
The smash hit of 1967 began as a novel written in 1962 by a disaffected young graduate named Charles Webb.
I was back from college and didn't have a lot on my mind, and the story itself is fictional, but the characters were pretty much reflections of real people.
Webb's parents typified the middle-class, materialistic values that kids in the early 60s were starting to rebel against.
It wasn't just, my parents don't understand me, but my parents don't understand me, and they're wrong, and they're phony, and they're materialistic, and they're dumb.
I had a bad relationship with my parents, but that's all it was. It was a very stiff, sort of formal family that we had. People didn't really talk about much.
So Webb spun his feelings into a short novel that found a publisher, but not much success.
It didn't take off. It wasn't a bestseller. The reviews were positive, but nothing to set the world on fire.
But a new generation of artists was searching for stories that spoke to the rebellious mood of the 60s, and up-and-coming producer Lawrence Terman seized on The Graduate.
So I got the book, read it, didn't feel he'd be a screenwriter, but the book really grabbed me. And I did what I tell my students not to do. I put up my own money for an option. Got me right here, but I did it. $1,000.
Terman sent a copy to the brightest, hippest, most irreverent young artist he could think of, 35-year-old comedian and Broadway director Mike Nichols.
A few days later was the message. Mr. Mike Nichols called, said he likes the book.
But in the early 60s, Hollywood's aging studio heads were in no mood for rebellious youth movies by young Turks like Larry Terman and Mike Nichols. They were focusing on big-screen epics and elaborate musicals.
Every studio turned me down. No one thought the book was funny. They didn't think it was good.
Movies were totally on the wrong side of the generation gap at the time.
The most fabulous film ever conceived from any standpoint.
They ignored what was going on in the rebellious youth. Hollywood had fallen on its ass.
After every studio passed on The Graduate, Terman approached a flamboyant exploitation producer.
I ended up with bottom-of-the-barrel schlockmeister Joseph E. Levine. But I'm an equal opportunity employee. Anybody's money is good. He put up the money, and we made the movie.
Terman and Nichols then turned to a hip young screenwriter known for his cutting-edge wit.
We were all of a generation that was kind of disaffected from their social and political structure. I mean, how do I get away from my mother and father and their Republican friends?
Buck Henry, Terman, and Nichols all identified with the young lead Benjamin, which made casting that role crucial.
Well, I think he's sort of me, but Mike thinks he's sort of Mike, and Larry Terman thinks he's pretty well Larry.
Well, that's me. Mike Nichols told me the same thing. I get goosebumps when I tell you that right now. It shows how congruent he and I were in responding to that character and that story.
Which is another reason all of us wanted to make the film.
Here's a Volkswagen that's big enough.
Determined to create a new kind of hero, they rejected the logical choice, square-jawed young heartthrob Robert Redford. Instead, they gambled on a nebbishy unknown named Dustin Hoffman.
On the outside, it's got a trunk up.
That was his first time you saw him on the scene, except for in a Volkswagen commercial.
And in the back, where most cars have their trunks, we have a trunk.
It was a seminal film in terms of helping to usher in the era of a different kind of leading man. You know, Rock Hudson was suddenly violently out.
Dustin Hoffman was an amazing approximation of my state of mind at that time. So that was astonishing to see.
What are you going to do now?
I was going to go upstairs for a minute.
Oh, I meant with your future, your life.
Well, that's a little hard to say.
His parents treat him almost as if he's a prize to show off to their friends.
Oh, I guess this isn't the bathroom, is it?
60s audiences, raised on the double entendres of the Doris Day era, would be shocked by the film's most radical twist. The virginal young hero is blatantly seduced by a cynical, older, married woman.
Mrs. Robinson, you're trying to seduce me. Aren't you?
Well, no, I hadn't thought of it.
No one could ever imagine watching a movie in which a young Nebbish had sexual relations with the wife of his father's partner. It was unimaginable at the time.
Oh, God. Oh, let me out.
Don't be nervous.
His parents force him to go on a date with Mrs. Robinson's daughter, Elaine, played by Catherine Ross.
Benjamin, are you having an affair with someone?
And the rest of the movie is about Benjamin's desire to connect with Elaine.
I want to know why you're here in Berkeley.
Well, look, I love you.
Inspired by cutting-edge European filmmaking, Mike Nichols introduced American audiences to a startling new auteur style.
The opening scene of The Graduate was incredible, where there's a close-up on Ben's face as he's walking through that party, and the claustrophobic feeling, and getting inside Ben's mind of the absolute non-knowledge of what the hell he's going to do with the rest of his life.
But as Nichols prepared his youth alienation comedy for release in late 1967, he faced a problem. The preppy youth culture of Charles Webb's 1962 novel had changed beyond recognition.
The book came out in an America and in a world that was completely different than the world in which the film came out in 5 years later.
At home, protests against the war persisted. In October '67, there are anti-war demonstrations in 50 U.S. cities.
We were in full Vietnam mode, the draft resistance.
And you had Vietnam, and you had the whole civil rights uproar having, just completely turned the country upside down. It was very tumultuous times.
None of these radical changes had made it into the film.
There's nothing really political in the film at all.
Coming up, would Mike Nichols' seemingly apolitical film be laughed off the screen by the riotous Vietnam generation? Or banned by their parents for its explicit sexuality?
It was considered very, very risque and very shocking.
The Graduate hits theaters just as the 60s melt down.
I've never seen anything as horrible in my whole life.
When Movies That Shook the World returns. In December 1967, Mike Nichols' radical new comedy, The Graduate, dripping with youthful alienation, middle-aged cynicism, and scenes of blatant sexuality, exploded onto movie screens with the pent-up force of a generation in revolt. Captivating youth, outraging adults, it instantly became a cultural phenomenon and a staggering box office smash.
I was astounded at the reception when the film opened. It just kept building and building. It was a cultural phenomenon.
For those of you who haven't seen The Graduate, you had better go because it's going to be difficult to get into.
And there were lines. I mean, I stood in a line that went around the block to go see it. And that wasn't even week one. And it played in that theater, I would think, for the better part of a year.
Kids raced to see the movie again and again, swelling the box office receipts.
Are you here for an affair, sir? What?
Kids were saying the dialogue as it came up. And I thought, uh-oh, I don't want this guy saying plastics 10 seconds before someone on the screen does.
They came already knowing it, and you could just feel the sort of rumble in the audience. It was like, in case you don't know, you idiot sitting next to me, the word is plastic. Everybody knows the word plastic.
Kids went to it because they recognized something that hadn't been dramatized for them. They weren't making films just for young people then.
The film captured a sense of aimless alienation that many 60s kids blamed on the mistakes of the older generation.
We're all so proud of you. Proud, 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 proud. What are you going to do now?
I was going to go upstairs for a minute.
Oh, I meant with your future, your life.
Well, that's a little hard to say.
Going to this movie was a way of pissing off the parents.
I think the younger generation loved seeing the older group described as phony, as alcoholic, as sex obsessed.
I want to get a drink.
Let's have a nightcap together.
Did you know I was an alcoholic?
What?
The film is a very, very flattering film to the younger generation because it suggests that that younger generation, the generation of the 60s, was defending its innocence.
It's too late! Not for me!
Against the seductive power of our corrupt parents.
At first, older moviegoers ignored what they assumed was a youth film. But as kids raved, parents got curious. When they started lining up, curiosity turned to shock.
Well, there was a generation gap in the reaction. The older conformist generation really felt threatened by it.
I just thought I would never live to see anything like this.
Below the standards of ordinary decency.
Many were particularly shocked by the way that Mrs. Robinson's seduction of Benjamin portrayed the older generation as callous and corrupt.
What are you doing?
Well, it's pretty obvious you don't want me around anymore.
This whole story about this young guy who's sleeping with his girlfriend's mother, it was considered very, very risque and very shocking.
It was like we'd never seen that before. We'd never seen that seduction and those complicated lives kind of weaving together.
Anne Bancroft's cynically sexual portrayal flew in the face of Hollywood's production code and the tame tradition of movie advertising.
The poster with Anne Bancroft's leg, somebody in local government in New York City tried to get it banned from the subways because this was, scatological.
Producers felt that Bancroft's legs weren't leggy enough and turned to substitute Linda Gray.
I was the poster. I was the leg on the poster. In the 60s, I was a model, and we would go from gig to gig, and that particular day, I was the leg.
Even The Graduate's soundtrack was revolutionary. Instead of using a composer, Nichols communicated mood straight to the heart of his young audience, using established hits by Simon and Garfunkel.
Are you going
Scarborough Fair.
I think that was one of the first really effective, soundtracks where the music really helped the movie a tremendous amount.
This is something that's difficult to appreciate today because many people have copied it since.
The lyrics are actually dialogue. I mean, they're really telling us how to see things or how to interpret things.
She once was a true love of mine.
But despite all its revolutionary innovations, The Graduate dared to ignore the hottest issues consuming 60s youth: drugs, the counterculture, and the swirling protests around civil rights in Vietnam. But young people instinctively sensed its deeper truth and declared it the signature film of their generation.
It wasn't about being drafted. It was about being drafted into life. It was about moving on to an uncertain future.
You look a little shaken up.
Oh, no, I'm just a little worried about my future.
Well, if you look at 1967, 1968, if you were young and you weren't worried about your future, something was seriously wrong with you.
Man, you gotta be an idiot not to worry, to go home.
Yet the heart of the movie totally captured the reasons why everything was happening the way it was. It was the alienation of youth searching for a way out.
Although Benjamin dressed like a preppy, young audiences saw him as a hippie at heart, embodying their rage against soulless materialism.
It was about rebellion. It was about a generation in complete disagreement with the generation beforehand. And that certainly resonated.
The conflict at the heart of the film, and of the 60s itself, is summed up by Hollywood's most famous one-liner.
Are you listening?
Yes, I am.
Plastics.
Exactly how do you mean?
There's a great future in plastics. Think about it.
We tended to call anyone over 30 or our parents' generation, we would refer to them as plastic because they conformed to a mold.
Hey, I have just one word for the graduate.
And the most thrilling moment for me was they reproduced that sequence with incredible accuracy and shot it for a commercial for the Peace Corps.
Remember it. One word. Plastic.
There's time enough to start a good career. First, find out something about life. If you don't, you may never learn that money isn't the only thing in it.
It was a great ad, and that made me happy.
Benjamin broke free of the corrupt Mrs. Robinson, finding fulfillment with her daughter instead. And The Graduate became the must-see film of the decade and the third highest grossing film in Hollywood history.
They told me the film was probably going to do $22 million, and I was elated. Well, the film did $55 million.
Coming up, could The Graduate's assault on middle-class values and its new sexual boldness change Hollywood forever?
Mrs. Robinson, you're trying to seduce me. People suddenly said, oh my God, we can go into the bedroom now.
Plus, author Charles Webb finally reveals his real-life inspiration for Mrs. Robinson when Movies That Shook the World returns. The Graduate's powerhouse success with America's youth sent a clear message to aging studio honchos, and they began moving Hollywood's target audience from adults to their kids.
The great lesson of The Graduate to the Hollywood establishment is that there was some real success to be found in movies becoming just a little hipper.
One of the important things to understand about The Graduate is it came out same year as Bonnie and Clyde. And like Bonnie and Clyde, it sort of trumpeted the end of the old production code.
It was a year when a new market was being found, a new kind of market.
Mrs. Robinson, you're trying to seduce me. People suddenly said, oh my God, we can go into the bedroom now.
Mike Nichols' subversive approach to sex, style, and anti-heroes also inspired a new breed of up-and-coming auteur directors who would radically alter the filmmaking equation.
There was this incredible critical mass that happens after The Graduate. It was not before. We're talking about Scorsese, Hal Ashby, George Lucas, Steven Spielberg.
And it kind of pointed the way that within the next few years, those genres that had been thought to be exploitation would turn out to be big time.
Hollywood finally got the message. Let's make smart movies about what young people are going through. And they did, and they have.
Ultimately, the most revolutionary member of The Graduate's team was author Charles Webb. Completing his rejection of materialism, he gave away all the millions he made from the book and movie, working minimum wage jobs instead.
It just seemed like it was necessary to get rid of things. We sold our wedding presents back to the people who gave them to us. That was how we got rid of them. Houses came along. We gave them to one to the Audubon Society, as I say, one to back to the realtor. You get rid of it however you can.
But there's one thing Webb has never given away until now.
Would you like me to seduce you?
What?
Is that what you're trying to tell me?
The identity of the real Mrs. Robinson, who inspired him to write the book.
This was based on a real woman who was the wife of one of the colleagues of my father. Her name was Jean Erickson, and her husband was Carl Erickson. They were close friends. They'd come over to play bridge with my parents.
Webb says she never seduced him, and they never had an affair. It was all just a young man's sexual fantasy.
It was an allure that I thought she had. It was the thing that made me finally sort of have to get it out of my system by writing the story.
That story has recently been revived as a hit play, and it remains vibrant today, illuminating a generation gap that will always bedevil parents and their children.
Well, the story's never going to go away. It's the story of life, but it'll always seem fresh.
The film's last scene encapsulates all the hopeful, tragic uncertainties of life in the nuclear age. As Benjamin and Elaine look ahead to their future, their faces reflect a mixture of joy, freedom, and confusion.
The final image of the bus pulling away is one of the most extraordinary of that decade. We rode with him on that bus into the counterculture, into the late 60s.